Entering the dungeon. Days were passing by and Zuleika tried almost everything to convince Joseph. However, Joseph kept refusing her. Her pride as a woman was hurt and her anger had increased because of that. When she realized that she wouldn't convince Joseph in the normal way, she decided to put him into a dungeon and make him beg her. With this in mind, she made this suggestion to her husband. "I can't go out and be amongst people because of that child. Everyone is talking about me. Put Joseph in a dungeon so that everyone will think he is guilty. That way, they might stop gossiping about me and let me have some peace." Zuleika's husband Kitfer knew that Joseph was innocent. However, he had a weakness for his wife, so he always did everything that she wished for. Even though he was not happy about sending Joseph to the dungeon while being innocent, he had to do what his wife asked him. He took Joseph out of his home and put him in the dungeons. Zuleika was hoping to be free of everyone's gossip when Joseph was sent to the dungeon. Her actual plan was to make Joseph beg her so that he would be saved from the suffering and torment in the dungeon. She expected it to happen in a short space of time. The people had forgotten about what happened and soon found something else to talk about. However, her second wish never happened. She was waiting pointlessly for Joseph to beg her to get him out of the dungeon. Joseph preferred to stay in the dungeon instead of accepting Zuleika's offer. He actually wasn't suffering a great deal in the dungeon as Zuleika had hoped, because Allah had turned this place into a place of education and worship. Joseph spent his days by praying and worshipping. He had earned the love of the others that were in the dungeon because of his morals and made everyone there forget that they were in a prison. They were all now happy. Joseph did his duties such as salat and fasting without fail. He also kept himself busy by teaching the others the blessings and knowledge that Allah had given him. He visited the ill and comforted those who were sad and gave them advice. He advised them to be patient. The dreams he interpreted turned out just as he had said. Joseph had only one problem in the dungeon, which was that he had a hard time to determine the times of the daily prayers because the dungeon was dark. It was hard to know whether it was day or night. Allah then taught him how to make a clock. Joseph then became the first person to make a clock. Clocks were widely used in Egypt after that. This is why Joseph is known as the master of clockmaking. Two young men's dreams. While Joseph was in prison, two young men were brought in. One of them was the king's baker, and the other was his sherbet maker. Some people who had tried to overthrow the king had made offers to them to poison him. The baker had accepted the offer, while the other had refused. When this plot was found out by everyone, the two men accused each other. So the king had decided to put the two of them into the dungeon until the truth was revealed. The two men had a dream one night. They went to Joseph so that he could interpret their dream. One of them said, "Dear Joseph, I had a strange dream last night. I was squeezing grapes in my dream and then offering them to the king. What do you think this means?" The other person then told of his dream. "I also had a strange dream. I was carrying bread on my head and then all of a sudden a wild bird started eating it. I woke up feeling frightened. What do you think this means?" Joseph asked them to believe in Allah before interpreting their dreams. He said, "I will interpret your dreams and you will see that they will turn out just as I tell you. Because this is a science I have been taught by Allah. I believe in him and accept him as the one." He then started interpreting their dreams. He first interpreted the sherbet maker's dream. "Dear friend, you will get out of here and carry on making sherbet for the king once again." He then turned to the bread maker and said, "You, on the other hand, will unfortunately be sentenced to death. Birds will flock over you and eat your flesh." Joseph then said to the sherbet maker, "You know my situation. Tell the king everything about me. Tell him that I have been put in here while being innocent." After a short while, everything that Joseph had said came true. The sherbet maker got out of the dungeon, went back to his job, and became among the king's closest servants. The baker, however, was found guilty and hanged. Unfortunately, Joseph's friend from the dungeon forgot to tell the king what Joseph had asked and got carried away with life at the palace. Even though he was very close to the king, he couldn't get around to talking about Joseph. Because of this, Joseph spent another 7 years in the dungeon. He had been there for 5 years before that, so in this way, Joseph had remained in the dungeon for 12 years. The king's dream. One night, the king of Egypt had a dream. In his dream, he was sitting by the river Nile, taking a break. All of a sudden, 7 healthy cows came out of the river. Then 7 weak and thin cows followed them. The weak cows attacked the strong ones and ate them all up. The king woke in horror and was shaking. He was terrified by what he had seen. He then fell asleep and had another dream. This time the king saw 7 dry grains eat 7 fresh grains. He woke up again feeling terrified. He was even more terrified this time. Both dreams were pointing out something to him. He immediately gathered his men and asked them to interpret his dream, but none of them knew how to. The king then asked for all of the wise men and dream interpreters in Egypt to gather at his palace. He told all of them his dream, but none of them made sense out of it or were able to interpret what it meant. In the end, they tried to get out of it and said, "This dream is a very complex and confusing one." Their answers didn't comfort the king, for he was still terrified by his dreams and couldn't accept that they were meaningless. But he couldn't find anyone to interpret his dream. Everyone had become anxious along with the king. They had no idea what to do. Then right at that moment, the sherbet maker remembered his friend Joseph. How could he forget? He knew Joseph could interpret dreams. 7 years had gone by, and he felt sorry for forgetting his friend's wish. He then turned to the king and said, "Dear king, I can interpret your dream." The king became very happy and said, "Really? Well, what are you waiting for? Go ahead." "I had a friend called Joseph in the dungeon. He is a very wise man when it comes to interpreting dreams. Send me to him and let me find out what your dream means. I think he is the only one who can interpret your dream." The king accepted his offer. He sent the man to the dungeon and told the sherbet maker about everything that happened. He wanted Joseph to interpret the dream. Joseph interpreted the dream like this: "There will be great fruitfulness for 7 years. You will gain a lot of grain during that time. However, you must save most of the harvest because after a few years there will be a great famine. During those 7 years you can eat the harvest you have saved. This way you will save yourselves from this disaster." This is the interpretation of the king's dream. Go and give him the news. The sherbet maker went back to the palace and told the king the interpretation. The king liked this interpretation. He had felt that the dream was a big warning against something. Joseph's interpretation had brought some enlightenment to the dream. The king had admired Joseph's deep knowledge from his interpretation. It was nothing but a shame for such a wise and clever person to be in the dungeon. He sent his men to the dungeon and ordered them to get him out of there and bring him to the palace.